Anyway.
Haribol.
Hare Krishna, Damodar.
Good morning, good evening, good day to wherever you are. Welcome, Praghosh Prabhu. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed, the Vedic Inquirer, on behalf of the GBC and as a standing GBC member. I gather your GBC for UK, for Scandinavia, for Ireland, and other parts of Europe, Switzerland and other places.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about why you took up such responsibilities as a GBC. What got you involved?
I guess the first thing I would say to that question, or the first part of the answer to that question, would be because I was asked. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I think we're a similar generation, and perhaps it's still the same, but certainly, you know, ISKCON in the early 80s, the whole mood was do the needful, and you kind of grew up with that kind of mantra, you know, you do the needful and you do what you're asked to do. So, and it wasn't that long after, you know, well, you know, a decade or a little bit more than a decade. And I was asked to do this service by somebody we both know very well, actually, Shivaram Swami. And it was really just being asked. And it was, for me, it was a bolt from the blue, by the way. I had no inclination, I had no inkling that question was going to be asked of me. In fact, it literally was quite surprising. For different reasons. I won't go into the history of that, actually. That would take a long time. But I was quite surprised. But then when I was asked, I gave it some thought and talked to some friends. And then I said yes. And here we are, 20 something years later.
Yeah, well, that's quite resilience, isn't it? 20 odd years doing the role. A lot of people may have beliefs about what it actually means to be a GBC. Sometimes there's this sense of arch, demons, or, people that are, wielding power and, scary Vatican and so on. Tell us what the practical experience is like of being a GBC.
Again, my first instinctive reaction to that question is it's a constant challenge. In my experience, and obviously I talk for myself, you can ask other GBCs for their experiences. In my personal experience, the first thing is it's a constant challenge to do the service every day while appreciating Krishna's statement in the Bhagavad Gita, Susukam Kartam Abhyayam. This process is joyfully performed. Because that's a struggle. Because so much of my service as a GBC deals with issues. It's issues based. It's challenges based, and that can weigh very heavily on you. And I often think to myself, it's kind of Krishna's way of forcing me to engage properly with the process. Because if you didn't, you just wouldn't. It would just become overwhelming, actually, because it's just, I mean. And as you get older, of course, and actually I've talked to some older devotees, older than me, people looking on. I'm sure most people looking on will be a lot younger than me. You can see I haven't dyed my hair white. It went that way of its own accord. But devotees older than me, I've talked to them. And it's interesting, again, that reference about joyfully performed. I've talked to devotees who do suffer from, basically anxiety-related issues and stress-related issues. And I noticed myself over the last relatively short period, checking email in the morning, it's kind of like you brace yourself for it. One of how much is coming in, just the sheer volume, and then whatever the volume is, what the actual nature of some of the emails will be that you receive, and then you have to deal with them, etc. So I think that would be your question was how. A
lot of people would see that you've got all the powers, you've got all the reins. So whatever's happening with the society is down to you. You've got the ability to drive it. You've got the ability to make things happen. I was just wondering if that is the practical experience or not.
Thank you for reminding me of the question, because that was the second answer I was going to give. Srila Prabhupada, in my humble opinion, or not so humble opinion, and it would be wonderful to, you know, I mean, I think we have that, many of us have that thought, you know, if Srila Prabhupada was to reappear for us, you know, just so we could answer him. And we were all given one question that we could ask Srila Prabhupada, you know, I'm sure we'd all have a question that we'd like to ask him. But for the purpose of this conversation, this wouldn't necessarily be the question I would ask him, but given that you've asked that question, would be that he really kind of created a conundrum in some respects. It's at least as you would compare it to how other organizations and institutions, etc., might function. And the conundrum from my perspective is that he used this phrase, and not just used it, it's the first item in his will, that the GBC body is the ultimate managing authority of ISKCON, of the Hare Krishna movement. But then, and there's so many references where Prabhupada talks about a GBC can't impose his opinion or his view or his authority, for instance, on temple presidents as an example. And so in one sense, we're seen, and everybody does see, I think, that knows ISKCON reasonably well, does see the GBC as being in charge. But actually and I'm not, by the way, I'm not asking for these powers. I'm just trying to answer your question.
Sure.
They have very little power. It's really a facilitating role, and you know, trying to work with devotees. And yes, these are the standards we're meant to follow. This was the vision that Srila Prabhupada had. Let's all work together towards it. But once you have somebody who chooses not to do that for whatever the reason may be, it's not that the GBC can just, you know, issue a dictum and then everything changes. It's really not like that. So there's a real conundrum between those two things, being the ultimate. Of course, ultimate as well can be misunderstood, I think. Or not misunderstood, but people have different understandings of what that word means. But I think in the context of the reality of the GBC role, it means, it doesn't mean absolute. It means has the last say, if you like. But it certainly doesn't mean absolute power and authority. That really doesn't exist. Like, for instance, and we've seen this in recent issues around the ISKCON world, that ISKCON's incorporated in many different jurisdictions across the globe. And it's that incorporation of ISKCON and the devotees or the officers that have that legal authority to run that organization, they're the ones that actually have, quote unquote, the power. It's not a GBC who is just internally has the role of being the ultimate managing authority. They have that authority based on Srila Prabhupada's instruction, but based on other aspects, legal, other kind of other aspects, they don't have that. They don't have that. So it is a constant challenge, actually. You know, obviously from some perspectives you think, and certainly in certain circumstances you think it would be great if you did have that, because it would make things more simple. You can make quicker decisions, etc., etc. But Srila Prabhupada didn't give that kind of authority, and it really very much is a facilitation and a negotiation, etc., and trying to work with people all the time.
It talks a little bit to scope. It would seem that there's all kinds of things that the GBC would have discussions about and involvement in, everything from Siddhanta, you know, did we fall from Vaikuntha or not, right through to policy, you know, should there be a Vaishnavi initiating or whatever, just through to very, you know, practical things and so on. To what extent do you see the GBC as being visionaries that are trying to foster and develop a society versus sort of ecclesiastical oversight or something?
Well, the one aspect that you didn't mention there, I thought you were going to mention it, was dealing with fires, dealing with crises,
Sure.
dealing with, stuff like that. And that tends to, my experience of the last 2 decades working with the GBC, that tends to be quite significant. And then that takes away from, you know, being able to develop really good long-term policies. And as you say, having that vision for ISKCON. To some degree with the vision, to some degree, that's already set, of course, by Srila Prabhupada, Lord Chaitanya. You know, the overall arching vision is set there. Of course, the world is ever changing, so we have the whole time place, and circumstance principle that things will be adjusting. We have to adjust for. So interesting. How do I see the GBC? I mean, one thing is that's very clear, and even within my time of the last 2 decades, is that the GBC has brought more and more devotees into the overall, leadership of ISKCON, for want of a better phrase. So you mentioned about Siddhanta as an example. So we have the Shastric Advisory Council that we brought in, that we will often defer to them to consider and deliberate and come up with papers on certain issues. So that really helps for the GBC to make a more informed decision and to see things from a wider perspective like that. If I was to break it down into percentages, a little bit like Rupa Goswami, I'd probably say about 50% would be dealing with just immediate issues that have to be dealt with, kind of crises, if you like. And then I'd say 25% for the other two, one setting a vision and 25% for having policies and producing policies for ISKCON to hopefully follow. And then, of course, that goes back to my answer to my first question. We do have some very good, in my humble opinion, policy statements and policy initiatives that we've worked on over the years, but implementing them, I think even governments find this difficult to some degree, that they can come up with laws, etc., but actually having them fully implemented is really the challenge, and that's even more challenging for the GBC, because the GBC doesn't have the normal arms of government that governments would have, all the different agencies, etc., to help them implement their policies. They have to kind of more or less do it themselves, or try to do it themselves. But yeah, as a general breakdown, I would put it something like that: 50%, 25%, 25%.
And what is the challenge with implementation? As you say, there's plenty of policy statements, but what makes it so challenging to see those things seen through at a roots and branch level?
One, communication, getting it out there and ensuring that everyone's aware of it. Two, buy-in. Once it's communicated, getting buy-in from all the various different aspects of ISKCON and all the different kind of units of ISKCON. So getting buy-in. And then, of course, even with that, depending on the level of buy-in you have, then for whatever reason, if people, you mentioned, I think, did you mention Vaishnavi Diksha Gurus a little earlier? So you take a policy like that, there'll also be significant resistance to it. So, yeah, they're all challenges. And as I say, if you were a government in the normal kind of understanding of that term, you're in Australia, I think. So if you're the Australian government there, and they vote to implement a policy on whatever the subject may be, they then can enforce it, and ultimately they have the judicial system to enforce it. So many different arms of state they have to enforce it. But that isn't there for the GBC. The GBC do not have that. So therefore, it very much goes back to the point I made earlier about facilitation and convincing. Really winning. Not so much the argument, but getting through to people as to why you feel this is important for ISKCON to do, why it will help to advance and promote Srila Prabhupada's mission, and all of that. And there's that phrase which I won't quote directly, but basically everybody has an opinion. Every single one of us has an opinion. Governments can kind of deal with that, as I said, through the other arms of the state that they have to implement what they want to implement. The GBC doesn't have that, so therefore they have to deal with all those opinions that come back and try to convince those devotees to support what they're trying to do.
So let's turn to raising children in Krishna consciousness. Clearly a really big strategic factor for our organization. We compared notes in our preamble with both grandpas, with both fathers, and so on, and perhaps as a householder you'd be a rare member of the GBC. Perhaps the majority of GBC will be people in the renounced order of life and so on. To what extent do you feel that there is a vision for what it means to grow up in Krishna consciousness, grow up in ISKCON?
vision for growing up in Krishna consciousness. How to answer that question? I mean, the vision going back before my time, into the 70s, the vision, to some degree set by Srila Prabhupada, of course, was that all children would go to Gurukula.
Yeah.
And that would be the grounding or the basis or foundation of their life then going forward in Krishna consciousness. And without getting into the history of that, you could definitely argue, and I understand both arguments here. You can definitely argue, let's put it this way, that's been less than a successful model. And not least because there was too much imposition. For some, it was fine, but for an awful lot, there was too much imposition.
Imposition on children.
Well, I was going to say both imposition on children and imposition in many respects on parents. They were the days, actually. It's interesting. They were the days when, in one sense, the GBC is no different in terms of what we were just talking about earlier about the powers that they have. But somehow or another, because it was so it was even during Prabhupada's time and so close to Prabhupada's time, that people sort of did almost spontaneously agree to what their authorities were requesting them to do, even if they didn't particularly like it. But anyway, that all, as we say, came out in the wash later on, and it was too much of an imposition on some. It may have suited some, but for some it was too much of an imposition on the children, on the parents, like that. So I think the GBC and ISKCON in general has very much changed from that mood now, and that style now. And I think the idea is that the responsibility primarily lies with the parents, to bring their children up in Krishna consciousness as best as they can, and in the way that they think is best for their children to grow up. And that, of course, was the case for myself, because although we have those examples in ISKCON where Gurukul was a priority based on Prabhupada's instructions and teachings, etc., there were other places where it weren't, and that was the case. That was the case for me. So really, when we first got married and then were having children, it was very much up to us to educate our own kids like that. And we just grouped together with a few other like-minded Grihasta couples and actually did that independently of ISKCON. But in terms of vision, I would say that, well, the first thing I would say is that, and we're all well aware of this, ISKCON and ISKCON's leadership has been quite scarred by that history, because that has been a very, very painful history that we're all aware of without necessarily getting into the details. So that's one thing. But I think nobody has any issue with our children being raised in Krishna consciousness. I mean, just a devotee just cannot have an issue with that. It just makes perfect sense. It's a question of how we apply that. And I think, going back to your point about us both being grandparents, you're a slightly younger grandparent than I am, but both of us being grandparents, the best people to do that are the family, to bring the child up, because you will have, as well as that desire. Why did we all join the Hare Krishna movement? We joined the Hare Krishna movement because we saw the futility of material life and absorbing ourselves in temporary things. That's why we joined the Hare Krishna movement. This was the eternal answer to our problems, if you like, and the challenges that we face in the material world. So obviously we want that same that same opportunity for the children, but because it will be the parents who take the primary role, there will also be compassion. Now, of course, Prabhupada warns about the compassion being too much, and therefore the children just get spoiled, and that then would also affect their growing up and becoming and being Krishna conscious, etc. But still, there has to be that sense of you're wanting the welfare, the best thing for your own children, your own grandchildren, and yes, you want them to be Krishna conscious, and maybe some aspects of that discipline is required, etc. But it's all on a foundation of love, and that you really want the best for these children. And you mentioned about the GBC being predominantly in the renounced order of life. That's true, although there are more and more Grihastas now, GBC members. I think, again, just off the top of my head, I would say it's roughly 2/3, 1/3, something like that. But that is a challenge, knowledge is one thing, realized knowledge is another thing. And, if you've known nothing but brahmachari life and then sannyas life, I think for some that would be a real challenge to be able to have sufficient understanding and sufficient empathy with both the grihastha ashram and with children. I think that would be a challenge. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question overall there, but maybe some thoughts on it.
Yeah, you mentioned that the first couple of waves of Gurukul children, they had a less than optimal experience, to put it mildly. And, there might be many of them that are still dealing with life outcomes as a result of that, still feeling very sore as a consequence of that.
And rightly so.
Does the leadership feel that it still owes anything to that group of devotees for what was missing? It may not have been that they were at the helm as individuals during that period, but is there a sense that this is a group that we're still indebted to in some ways?
Yes, I certainly do personally, and I think it would be fair to say that the leadership would feel similar. They're not always so sure in terms of how to really properly and adequately address that. But I think that would be the move, and by the way, just let me, because sometimes these conversations can become sort of almost one-dimensional. When I first started to learn of the stuff that was going on, actually, a city that we both know well, I was actually in Belfast. And I remember in those days, of course, there was no mobile phones, there was no internet, and none of that. So I remember receiving a letter as temple president, a circular that someone had sent out outlining. It was the first time I think that was 1984. It was the first time that I had ever become aware that there was any kind of, and I think even my initial reaction was, somebody is just making this up, because that was wholly wrong to have to assume that. But anyway, it was outlining some of the problems. I think in the Mayapur Gurukul, I think in particular it was talking about, and it was shocking. It was just extraordinary, because you join the Hare Krishna movement, you have this youthful enthusiasm. It's like, wow, here's the solution, not just to my problems, but to the world's problems, and then you focus on Prabhupada, this extraordinary saintly person, he just becomes an instant hero once you read the first page or two of the Lilamrita or whatever it might be. And you're just thinking, wow, and you're just riding on this wave of extraordinary revelation, extraordinary enthusiasm, bliss. I remember we used to have that saying in those days, the temple room, the ceiling might be sort of 9 foot high, but once the kirtan got going, you could literally feel your head touching the ceiling. You were jumping so high because of all this, enthusiasm and positivity. Then you read a letter like this. How can this have anything to do with the movement that Srila Prabhupada created and the movement I joined? This is just insane. This has got nothing to do with it, But unfortunately, as we now know, it was all true. But then I think one of the first times I ever went to Mayapur, I actually, maybe the second time actually, I made it my business to go and seek out people who had gone through the Gurukul in Mayapur to find out what their thoughts were. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, it was basically a 50-50 split. 50% of them had a wonderful experience. And of course, 50% of them had an absolutely hellish experience. And the interesting thing was, and of course, now we know this, I think, from other studies, not by devotees, but by non-devotees, it was amazing how the ones who had the positive experience actually had virtually no knowledge that the others were going through a hellish experience. I found that incredible, because that, to my mind, that kind of told me the people who were involved in this in terms of the abuse, they were really calculated. They were knowing how to separate these camps and how, and how to contain the whole thing. And I think even within the group of boys primarily, girls as well, not excluding that, but certainly with Mayapur at least, it was boys primarily, how even the boys that suffered abuse didn't many of them, it was years later before they knew their fellow classmates and friends were suffering abuse. So that whole thing, and I just remember being really crestfallen, you know, really a sort of a weight kind of came on me, thinking, this has destroyed my last, you know, 3, 4, 5 years from the time that I joined. This is effectively changing my whole perspective on this. You know, I'm not saying that was a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it as it was. In one sense, you know, we have the book, you know, chant and be happy. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, chant and be happy, you know, and put blindfolds on and earplugs in for the rest of your life, and you know, then you can just chant and be happy. But all this stuff coming at you as well, it was like, wow, you know, it was very difficult.
Yeah, and of course we're talking about this as if it was all in the past. What's your view of the current situation? And I'll just share with you, there's a few ways at Vedic Inquiry that we're looking at elements, let's say, of child protection. There's preventative measures, background checks, and other ways to absolutely keep kids safe. You know, so what's our sense of how that's going on? Then there is, in the event of reports, our general compliance with legal process, our referring things to CPO, non-interference with the CPO, and then also things like victim support afterwards. What's your sense, if you were, you know, looking at ISKCON's report card right now, would we get an A, a B, a C? What would we get?
Yeah, I mean, I could give a glib answer and say something like, you know, the way teachers do it, you know, reasonable but could do better, or something like that, you know. But for sure, you know, and as I often say to my fellow GBC members and other devotees, that Kali Yuga is ever progressing. Now, of course, we know that the one incredible benediction of Kali Yuga is that we have the holy name has descended, and that, of course, ultimately, and I do retain that belief and faith that ultimately that can change absolutely everything. But there are conditions attached to that in terms of the purity of the chanting, etc., in terms of the volume, the amount of people engaged in that process. So the reality is, you know, we can't be complacent, you know, and Kali Yuga is ever progressing. So therefore, you know, with something like child abuse, if we think just because we've put a CPO in place and just because we put other measures in place, that somehow or another that's going to eradicate child abuse within ISKCON, absolutely not the case. You know, so therefore we have to be ever vigilant in trying to, you know, anticipate it, you know, and obviously deal with it whenever it arises, and deal with it properly in terms of what you just mentioned there about the autonomy of the CPO and all of that kind of thing. So the creation of the CPO in the first place obviously was a very good and big step, because it had two main mandates. The first mandate was obviously to protect children, as in the name, and deal with cases of child abuse, and you know, ensure that the people responsible for those activities would be be in receipt of appropriate consequences as a result of what they've done, and then also to keep them away from ever being able to access children again, certainly children within our organization. And then the other main part of the mandate for the CPO was to educate us all on the importance of protection of children, and to provide them with you know, all sorts of educational materials, all of us, including the children. And part of that then also was to help the children who have suffered abuse within our movement. I think that part in particular has been poor. That part has been poor. The other parts have been, as I said, I think reasonable, but we should not become complacent. But in terms of looking after those who have suffered at the hands of devotees serving as ISKCON devotees, has not been very good. I mean, you know, there are different reasons for that. You know, it generally involves resources, Lakshmi, etc. And of course, you know, trying to raise Lakshmi for anything is difficult, and that isn't really an exception to that. So yeah, you know, I think it's I think we're in a much better place than we were in the late 70s and the early 80s. And also, it depends on the parts of the world that you're talking about. Certain parts of the world, you know, take this, in my humble opinion, more seriously than other parts of the world. And certain parts of the world, also certain parts of the world are helped by outside society, because outside society takes this very seriously in certain parts of the world, and we can benefit from that. You know, so if I think of a place like the UK, again, I'm not suggesting that it's perfect in any way, shape, or form, but I would say that that would be doing maybe a little bit better in relation to both the rooting out of child abuse and also the looking after of children or adults now, of course, in many cases, who've suffered from it, might be doing better than maybe somewhere in South America, as an example, simply due to resources, etc., and different things like that. So yeah, you know, wherever we are, I'm not sure I'd put a mark on it. I think that would be hard to do. But the one thing that's absolutely crystal clear to me is we can do better. And we will always be able to do better. No matter how good we think we're doing, we will always be able to do better and improve.
Well, let's just explore that idea of societal values and so on. We might have our own internal reference, you know, apichet sudaracharo. So particularly if it's a historic case and it's perhaps somebody senior that's highly regarded amongst others, there might be the tendency to go, well, Prabhupada was always kind. If someone fell down, he didn't really hold it against them. And there are other, as you say, societal attitudes that would say, this is beyond a fall down. This isn't consensual sex or, you know, smoking a cigarette or something. This is a violation of a child. There's no grounds upon which somebody can just be reinstated in a position of privilege. I don't know if you have a view on that. To what extent are we taking a lenient position based on Shastra and what Shastra says about sadhus redeeming themselves? To what extent should we take into account community sentiment, both the devotee community in respective locales, as well as the general population?
Yeah, I do have a view, and I have a quite strong view, and a view that is either sometimes not appreciated or a view that is seen as somehow or another too simplistic, which I completely dispute. And I'll go back to that. First, I just want to go back to the point about, that you made about Srila Prabhupada, and you quoted the Api said to the Statutory verse. Doesn't apply, in my humble opinion. Doesn't apply. And the reason it doesn't apply is Srila Prabhupada could practically do anything, practically have done anything when he was physically present with us, and we would have accepted it because of his stature, because of his purity, because of his, you know, complete freedom from any personal motivation for whatever decision that he would or wouldn't have taken. We don't have that adhikar. We will never have that adhikar. Therefore, we cannot just simply say, I think Prabhupada would have done this in this particular situation, particularly if it's a controversial thing, like what we're talking about, the subject we're talking about. We can't do that. We simply cannot do that. And anyone who argues that, in my humble opinion, anyone who makes that argument is not qualified to be in any leadership role in Srila Prabhupada's movement. So, as a result of that, then it becomes really simple to me, really, really simple. You mentioned that child abuse is not the same as an ordinary fall down, and you used the word related to it not being non-consensual and impossible to be consensual, simply because a child legally cannot give its consent like that until, again, different jurisdictions, but let's use the general age of maybe 18. So therefore, it can never be consensual. I remember, by the way, you know, and again, I won't mention a name because that isn't really appropriate, but somehow or another, due to circumstance, I was once asked on behalf of the CPO, this is many years ago, I was asked to actually interview a devotee who was guilty. I can say that now because it's all completely clear that the person was completely guilty. So they were guilty of quite serious child. It's all serious, of course, but you know, again, just from the physical, whatever manifestation it takes place on the physical level, some are more gross than others. So this was a particularly gross one. And I interviewed that person for about an hour, and it was recorded. And then I sent the recording to the CPO director at the time. What was amazing about that was I asked one question. And the person just went off on an hour-long answer to my one question. Basically justifying what they had done. And part of their justification was, or the main justification was, after some time, 5, 10, 15, whatever it was, minutes into them abusing this child, there was some physical reaction from the child's body. And they said that physical reaction means they agreed to it and they were enjoying it. And I just remember thinking to myself, how despicable, how despicable. You're taking advantage of a child. Prabhupada references that actually to a famous rape case in Calcutta, actually, where a woman was raped, but the defense were trying to argue that because there was some physical reaction from her body, after some time into the crime, that somehow or other justified it. And it's just so despicable to do that. You do something horrendous and then you try to justify it on the basis that, it's just quite incredible. So I don't know why I shifted onto that, actually. I'm sorry, Damodar, but basically you're asking me, oh yes, how should we deal with
yeah, to what extent we take community sentiment into mind versus almost taking a singular view of what do we do to support our friend, what do we do to support this sadhu who stumbled. And I tend to think of these things as misplaced compassion, but I do understand that some people will try and argue Shastra says this and community sentiment shouldn't come into it. But I just wondered where you stood on that. And, I'm not expecting you can necessarily speak on behalf of the whole GBC, but just in getting a feeling for how those things are weighed up.
Yeah, and we go back to the Api sets to the Charachova. So I don't think it's applicable. Well, let me put it like this. First off, there are so many contrary quotes actually from Prabhupada. He talks about, the Hare Krishna movement, and he actually says about it, he references sannyasis actually, and he says when a sannyasi has some problems, people will focus on that like a black spot on a white sheet, and you can never remove it. Then he talks about Caesar's wife being above suspicion. Then, of course, we have not related to child abuse, but we have Lord Chaitanya banishing Chota Haridas because he, just looked at a woman inappropriately, just looked at her, didn't go near her, didn't touch her, and that's an adult woman again. We're talking about, in that sense, someone who can consent. So my view is that this phrase zero tolerance is sometimes used, and I don't think zero tolerance is fair because it implies that we're not tolerant. I don't think that, I think that's rubbish that we're not tolerant. My simple point is that we used to have this phrase when I was a kid in school, the teacher would say, if you blotted your copybook, so I guess you know what that means, you get an ink mark on your copybook. So my view is very, very simple. If you've blotted your copybook in this lifetime, so this is after, because sometimes you hear the Jagai and Madai argument being used. So, they were such big rascals, such big demons. But, Lord Chaitanya, Lord Nityananda had all this mercy for them. Haridas Thakur gave them all this mercy. Yes, but from the time they surrendered, from the time Jagai and Madai surrendered, I'm not aware that they ever engaged in that activity ever again. So this is different because this is, when we first join the Hare Krishna movement and we aspire to take initiation, we have to be following the 4 rules and chanting 16 rounds a day prior to initiation. Then at initiation, we make a formal commitment to follow those vows for the rest of our life. And then in the case of sannyasis, or what to speak of gurus, etc., we take further vows. So we're taking all these vows. If we then violate those vows in such a gross way as to abuse a child, take advantage of a child, and why are they taking advantage of children? For personal gratification. It's just so simple. You're taking advantage of a child for personal satisfaction. Once you do that, you can never serve again in any position of authority in the Hare Krishna movement, in my humble opinion, whether that be a temple president, whether that be a GBC, whether that be a guru, whether that be a sannyasi. You cannot serve in any of those roles again. In 3 or 4 years ago, when we had our 50th anniversary, we produced a nice publication, or some people would say it was too glossy, too whatever. But anyway, it was a nice publication. Part of that publication, it gave some statistics. And one of the statistics was how many people on the planet we estimate are serious followers of the Hare Krishna movement, seriously endeavoring on the spiritual path. And the conservative estimate that we gave was 10 million people. Currently, I don't know if you know this, but there is around about 100 people who serve as initiating gurus in this movement.
Yeah.
35 GBCs, and there are around, I think, around 200 sannyasis. I could be slightly wrong, maybe a bit more, actually, maybe a bit less. But anyway, I think it's around 200. 100
Yeah.
groups, 35 GBCs. Put them all together, 200, 100, 335, 335. So in those three leadership positions, we have 335 devotees serving in those positions. Probably less, actually, because some of them duplicate. Some of the sannyasis are DVCs and many of them are gurus. So actually, it's probably only around 300. Let's say 300. 300 devotees serving in those roles. Yet we've 10 million people practicing Krishna consciousness. Is anybody seriously telling me that those 9,997,700, yeah, that's what it is somebody seriously telling me that all of those devotees cannot advance in Krishna consciousness because they're not serving as a GDC, a guru, or a sannyasi? It's ridiculous. It's just completely ridiculous, because I've heard that argument. Oh, but it's their service. Oh, they'll be discouraged. Oh, we have to encourage them. You can chant Hare Krishna, you can go out and book this reading, you can go on Harinam, you can, distribute prasadam, you can do millions of things in Krishna service. You don't have to be a GBC or a guru or a sannyasi to do that. So therefore, in the mood of protecting, in the mood of properly respecting the people who have suffered this abuse, and that they see that it's taken seriously, in the mood of protecting Srila Prabhupada's movement in the eyes of the general public, and in the mood of honoring Srila Prabhupada's concern about charlatan meditators that he talks about in some different purports, and that he talks about the black spot on the white sheet, and Caesar's wife should be above suspicion. For all of those reasons, respecting those that have been abused, protecting the movement, honoring Srila Prabhupada's references, the GDC should not even have to act to say that these people cannot serve in those roles going forward. They should do it. They should have the integrity, decency, and honor to say, I have blotted my copybook in a very serious way after taking my vows. And we all know what the vows are. So after taking those vows, I have now fallen, not just transgressed them, but in the most egregious, gross, and horrendous way. Therefore, I am stepping back from all of those roles for the reasons that I've outlined. And that for me, and if they don't do that, then the GBC has to act to ensure that is what happens. That's my view. And I've expressed that to the GDC body many times. And yeah, I can never see me changing that view. And the other thing I should add, just in closing, if I ever do something anywhere, or anything remotely along those lines, I would hope that I would have the honor and dignity and integrity to follow my own advice and just simply, remove myself from all those leadership roles and just practice Krishna consciousness like everybody else is practicing Krishna consciousness.
And would you be confident that your fellow GBCs would draw the line in the same place, or is that yet to be, discussed and agreed?
Well, some certainly would. That's for sure. Some certainly would. But you, in framing the question, you referenced Api Setsu Characho, etc., etc. I mean, again, I'm not arguing against that verse. They're Krishna's words. I'm not arguing against that. That's fine. We all can be forgiven. We know that every single living entity in the cosmic manifestation will ultimately go back to the spiritual world. We know that. So no matter how horrifying, or how horrifying the activities we might engage in while in the material realm, ultimately we will go back to the spiritual world. So that's not in dispute. So the Api Setsu Characho verse is fine. Everybody will be forgiven. But my point is, but they don't have to serve as a guru, a sannyasi, or a GBC, at least in the rest of this lifetime, maybe next lifetime, whatever they can, but not this lifetime. Set the example. So your question, the GBC, so some certainly do. But yeah, some for whatever, and if they were, maybe someone will listen to this conversation. But if I was with them now, I would say some may do for some strange, odd, peculiar, weird, unjustifiable reason, and I would urge them, to pop on.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking back earlier to you talking about, the CPO now exists and so on. One of the concerns I think that is generally shared on Vedic Inquirer is that when in the late 90s the CPO was first set up, I think in response to the Turley case or whatever, it had a budget at something like 160,000 a year. That's now 10,000 a year. That seems like an awfully minimal amount for a reasonable office. I think Hare Krishna's in Britain podcast referenced that they did a search that £2 million a year is spent on devotee wages in the UK, according to whatever public records there are. 10,000 to run the international CPO. I mean, is that sustainable? Is that something that is impossible to fix? It doesn't seem to reflect well on the society.
The first thing just to say, just to clarify, I wouldn't use the word wages. I would use the word devotee maintenance.
Devotee maintenance.
No, it's important. It's important because, going back to when we joined the movement in the early 80s, I think the statistics are that 96% of devotees were ashram based and 4% were congregational based. And now, according to my congregational guru in the Hare Krishna movement, Prabhu, he tells me that that's completely flipped. It's now 4% ashram based and 96%.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. So from that perspective, devotees who aren't living in ashrams, so they're living outside. And of course, if you take somewhere like the UK, where our main temple is, of course, Bhaktivedanta Manor, it happens to be one of the most expensive parts of the UK. So
yeah.
If you're living near there, your rent or your mortgage is going to be
I'm not arguing that there's no legitimacy for devotees to receive some kind of stipend to live on. It's just the proportions seem to be out of step.
I'm going to go to that, but just because just to clarify that it's not that it's not as though they're living on an ISKCON wage and they're driving like a Lamborghini and whatever like that.
Sure.
It really is just the devotees need to survive, so they have to get some kind of income, Otherwise, what happens is you have another phenomena, which is true in other yatras for sure, and even the UK yatra to some degree, is you force devotees out into the regular workplace, if you like, and then you kind of lose them to the organization in terms of practical service because they have no time because they're fully engaged in other activities. Yeah. So, but to go to your point specifically about the CPO budget, and by the way, just again as a point of information, the UK Yatra I think is the largest contributor to the CPO budget, if I'm not mistaken, in the ISKCON world. But yeah, it's pathetic. It's paltry amount of money. But that's the official amount, just to clarify, that comes directly from the GBC. It's not the actual budget of the CPO because there are many other, we're all encouraged and most of us do, including GBC members, they contribute privately then to the budget, from whatever personal funds or whatever the case may be. The challenge with the official budget, as given by the GBC body, is that where does the GBC get their budget from? That's one of the complications. Basically, it's a tax on temples, and that's a very uncomfortable dynamic. That the money has to come from temples like that, and many temples around the world, they're really struggling. They literally can't really be affording to up their budgetary contribution. The the GBC annual budget that they have for everything that they're supposed to do in the movement is about $100,000 US. Now when you think about that in the context of your average temple, you just said, for instance, 2 million for devotee maintenance in the UK. I'm not sure. I would have to go and check that figure actually, but whatever it is, it's a significant figure. So practically every temple on the planet has a bigger budget than the global GBC body have. How to rectify that, because this goes back to your very first question about the GBC having quote unquote power to implement things. If they have no resources, they have no money whatsoever, that also becomes very, very difficult. So, but how to rectify it? increase the taxes on temples, it just isn't a solution. That we could get into another pet topic of mine, beard action. But anyway, we'll leave that aside for a second. So the reality is that the GBC budget is a paltry budget to start with, but yet the CPO, to the best of my knowledge, I think I'm right in saying this, gets the biggest portion of the annual GBC budget. But I agree, it's paltry, and it should get huge amounts more, Lakshmi, than it gets. But to come directly from the GBC have to increase somehow or another, increase their budget. How do they increase their budget? That is a challenge.
To what extent would this, the whole child protection agenda, be sort of a shared concern, not just at an issues level, as you said at the beginning? Quite often there's a firefighting kind of nature to GBC, and there might be particular fires at particular times. But on an ongoing basis, would this be in priority A, B, or C? Where would this generally sit? Child protection and general provision for next generations and so on. Big concern, minor concern, just one of many things?
Well, I mean, again, just going back to what I just said there, that although it's a paltry budget that the CPO gets, it is actually, I think, the largest budget that the GDP gives to anything else. From their minimal budget of $100,000 a year, it's 10% of it basically. Every single GBC gathering, whenever we come together, we always get a full report from the CPO director as to how all things child protection are going in ISKCON, and what we can do, what more we need to do, and practical steps that we can take, etc. So, I would say, see, it's kind of like one of these things where, even those what I've just mentioned, those things happen, it's just not enough, because there's so much more that needs to be done. But I would say, at least from a kind of an intention, let's use that word, maybe from the intention perspective, it is definitely high up on the list of things of priority that the GBC are concerned about and want to do something about. But yeah, that doesn't mean that it translates into sufficient practical steps that end up getting taken. But intention-wise, and to the forefront of the mind, it would be arguably it would be in the top three, I guess, of concerns for the GBC. Yeah.
As you say, the challenge, of course, is the GBC are almost starved of having an executive budget to enact their vision or whatever, which does seem to be quite a challenge. We did a little bit of research about GBC resolutions, and I'll just do a scattergram of a few. 1989, there was a resolution that these, child protection matters they'll always be reported to the relevant local government agency. There was also one in 1990, something similar there. I'm just looking to see if there's a few others that that it is an apparat. It's not just a question of offence. The very thing that you stated earlier, that no one who's guilty of these things could ever serve in one of those offices. I guess the concern is, just as you were saying, that sometimes when the GBC passes a resolution, it's hard to implement. The worry is that sometimes GBC doesn't even implement its own standards, and or it goes flaky or whatever on those things. So I don't know if you've got a comment on that.
Well, on the first one that you referenced about reporting to statutory authorities, all I can say, as it relates to my own area of responsibility, that is our policy. That is our policy. We don't evaluate the accusation first before doing that. If anybody makes an accusation of child abuse against someone serving in ISKCON, it's immediately reported to the outside authorities, and then the outside authorities can evaluate it as to whether its veracity. We don't do that. It's a simultaneous process, actually. It's reported to the outside authorities, and it's reported to the CPO. And then, as the management of the YATRA, We have no more involvement in that. You know, it's all done then by the outside authorities and by the CPO. But again, whether that's consistent across the world, you know, like if you take somewhere like India as an example, I could be wrong on the date here, so forgive me if I'm wrong on the date, but I think it's only within the last decade that the state government have actually you know, passed a law that states that child abuse is illegal. So you know, 10 years ago, and certainly beyond 10 years ago, it wasn't illegal to abuse children in India. So from a cultural point of view, you can see why some parts of the world may not take this issue as seriously as other parts of the world take it. And you know, on one level, we shouldn't be affected by what the cultural norms are. We are trying to instill the culture of Krishna consciousness on the planet, if you like. So we shouldn't be, you know, affected or not affected, but we shouldn't necessarily take those cultural considerations so much into consideration. But the simple fact of the matter is, you are affected from wherever you're born, from wherever you grow up. You tend to retain some of those, you know, cultural influences. So
Yes.
so it probably would be quite naive to think that somehow or another they can all just be brushed aside. So yeah, so whatever about the what was I going to say there? Something came up on the screen and distracted me.
Apologies.
Yeah, no problem. But yes, they are resolutions. They have been passed. To the best of my knowledge, again, my area of responsibility, we do follow that one about reporting to the authorities. Then there was another one, though, one a little bit later. I can't remember, and you made some comment. Oh, the GBC, do the GBC. Oh, yeah, no one can serve in a leadership position. Again, as far as the CPO at least are concerned, if someone is found responsible for any kind of child abuse, then that usually is the case. I could be corrected, but as far as I'm aware, the CPO do actually stipulate that they cannot serve in those leadership positions. Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, broadly speaking, those resolutions are followed.
Thank you. Yeah, we're coming up on an hour or so, and so mindful that we might want to, you know, let you get back to your busy day job. And I'm really appreciative that you've made some time to come and address us. As you know, there's quite a lot of conversation going on and quite a lot of concern about the society's performance in this area at the moment. I suspect there's about 1,700 or so people that subscribe to Vedic Inquirer now, and sometimes it's also shared more broadly. If you had a closing message as a member of the GBC to all those who are, you know, concerned about ISKCON's general performance when it comes to child protection and so on, what would be your general message to all of those devotees?
One thing, I'll speak maybe from a practical point of view rather than rather than sort of an aspirational point of view. But one thing is always inform of your concerns. You know, it's such an important issue. It's such a noble issue, the protection of our children. We know actually, you know, from a philosophical point of view, if you like, and from a Vedic point of view, the protection of children, of course, is you know, it's one of the children are one of the elements of society, like the elderly, like the, you know, like the sick, etc., like the cows. That leaders have a responsibility to make sure that they're protected. And Prabhupada talks about children, you know, the protection of children gives the human form of life its best chance to prepare a way of liberty from material bondage. It's so ironic, you know, that they are our future leaders, and if they're trained properly in Krishna consciousness, wow, what a positive future the planet has if we have all these wonderfully empowered devotees who have been devotees from birth. And by, of course, the issue of child abuse, so many of them have been so scarred, and you know, that's arguably the biggest tragedy, really. You know, we're literally doing something. One, the people who are guilty of it, but two, the leadership, if it doesn't properly deal with it, we're literally shooting ourselves in the foot, both feet, in terms of assuming we're all assuming we all want what Srila Prabhupada want, and that is to give Krishna consciousness to broader society. We're literally shooting ourselves in both feet from doing that. So please communicate all the time, and also, you know, personally, again, as a parent and a grandparent, I'll just speak personally on this, you know, and this is why I have absolutely. Sometimes I know some devotees take exception to the fact that some devotees express this in an angry way or in an overly critical way or like that, and they think, can they not be more balanced in the presentation? Personally, I have no qualms about that whatsoever, because, you know, I've got a 5-year-old granddaughter and a 2-year-old granddaughter right now. I actually spent time with them yesterday. You know, if anybody interfered with those two kids, you know, I wouldn't be responsible for my reaction. You know, so for anybody to say, oh, it's too angry or it's too emotional, you know, cheat on them to say that. You know, you go have a child or a grandchild or whatever the case may be, and see how you would feel if some stranger or even worse, some person that you respected was to then, you know, interfere with them and take advantage of them in the grossest kind of way. See what your reaction would be. So all I would say is that, you know, let us all, and there are, it's not that the leadership, you know, and certainly not all the leadership is somehow or another not concerned about this subject or doesn't take this subject seriously. They very much do, you know. So for me, it's kind of like, let's unite together and work together on this, because it is a massive challenge. We know from Srimad Bhagavatam that, you know, Lord Brahma was guilty of this very thing. You know, so this isn't a new thing. This has been with us. So in that sense, it's like, you know, to actually effectively deal with it, we need all the help we can get. We need to be united and we need to cooperate together to eradicate this. And there are huge amounts of devotees in the leadership of ISKCON, not just the GBC, but at temple level, at regional level, etc., who are very concerned about this. So I would just say, let us all unite together to really do everything we possibly can to significantly reduce, if not completely eradicate, this curse from our society.
Now, we do have a few questions if you still have an appetite to keep going.
Sure. I don't know what the questions are, but yeah.
Well, feel free to veto any, and I might also put a little extra spin on a few of them. So this is one that Jiva Goswami came up with. And, you know, just another angle on this, it could be that if somebody has many disciples, then there's an extra complexity in terms of dealing with that person, in terms of, you know, ISKCON's responsibility to the followers, the shaking of faith and so on. So is there the risk of almost a two-tier system here, which even includes the application of justice and so on?
Well, the one-word answer to that question is yes, there is definitely that risk. I remember, you know, the financial crash, whenever that was, 12, 13 years ago, whatever that was, this new phrase came out that, you know, too big to fail. And it was particularly referring to banks. You know, the banks are too big to fail. And therefore the governments had to prop them up with taxpayers' money, etc. So it's kind of similar. You know, that if you have somebody in a very prominent position, we've talked about GBC, guru, sannyasi, like that. If you have somebody in a very prominent position who is either accused of this or even indeed guilty of this type of thing, yeah, to use your phrase, that you have a two-tier system. What I would say is that on that is, one, I fully accept it can be more difficult to deal with that scenario. That's just a reality of life, you know, and I doubt that will ever change. It will be and is more difficult to deal with that type of situation. But again, I go back to what I said earlier. I don't care. You do the right thing. And particularly if you're in a position of leadership for running the movement, you do the right thing. You don't consider what potential consequences there may be. because otherwise, what's the alternative? The alternative is you start thinking of possible consequences, and then you try to mold your decision around mitigating against those consequences. And before you know it, you're in all sorts of compromises and watering down all sorts of things, so that, what sort of solution is that? Better you simply do the right thing. Then you're going to have Krishna and Prabhupada on your side. You do the right thing, and wherever the cards fall, whatever the consequences may be, deal with them as they fall. And ironically enough, both in my own personal life, in my ISKCON life, etc., my experience always is that the feared consequences, or the consequences that you fear might flow from some decision, nearly always end up being far less than what your fear was. In other words, your fear tends to expand and make it's going to be much more difficult than it actually is. But I would say 99 times out of 100, that isn't the case. So that's my and I've expressed this also to the GBC in various circumstances and situations that we've had to deal with over the years. Don't let ourselves be influenced by that. Don't. Just do the right thing, and then we'll deal with whatever comes as a consequence of that. And then that you're dealing with it from a position of at least moral authority and the authority of integrity. Whereas if you do it the other way, it's all. And then the other thing is, of course, once you go down that route of trying to orchestrate, trying to manipulate, trying to engineer, what you see to be the best outcome. People see that. People see that that's what you're doing, and therefore, they'll take advantage of that by anything they want. They'll know, well, these guys, they don't operate on the basis of principle. They don't operate on the basis of doing the right thing. They're open to negotiation and this and that, and it just becomes all murky and wrong, so it doesn't matter. Yes, it's an issue in answer to the question, and there's no doubt that it does make things more difficult. That's just the way it is across the planet, that powerful people, do have that ability to try to, whatever. But I'm just saying that we should identify that, we should be aware of that, but then we should do the right thing and then just deal with the consequences as they fall.
Thank you, Prabhu. I'll just one last question, and then we'll let you go. In 10 years, the majority of current GBC members will have aged out of their service. How are we addressing succession planning, in essence? Also, Jiva Goswami.
Yeah, we've had, I think 2006 was the first succession initiative that we set up. And marking the card again, it would be, reasonable, but could do better in terms of how that's gone so far. I mean, we're all devotees, inevitable time, we are now, an hour into this, more than an hour into this conversation. So our lives are already an hour shorter in the context of the material body. So time is going to dictate this anyway. We're going to all move on. But we do have a succession plan, again, depending on the part of the world where there's more devotees, like that, we tend to be more successful with it. But just in answer to that question, and actually, just again, I was 60 last month. Yeah, I was 60 last month. And I'm one of the younger GBCs, and I think to myself, wow, because as you get older, your ability to deal with stuff, your capacity for absorbing more and more, challenges, etc. It reduces. The body's getting older, the mind's getting older, etc. So I think of my GBCs that are 10 years older than me. I think, my God, I'm not looking forward to that. But having said that, when I became a GBC, I was the youngest, or newest and youngest GBC at that time. But since I've become a GBC, there are at least another half a dozen devotees who have become GBCs who are younger than me. So it is actually already happening. It's not that it's not already happening, that new blood is coming onto the GBC body. But personally, I think we could do better. There is this quote from Prabhupada, GBC for life. And I mean, my view of that is that GBC for life, as long as you're able to do the service, and enthusiastic to do the service. I mean, if you're not really able to do it due to physical or mental incapacity of one degree or another, and you're not enthusiastic to do it, I can't imagine that Prabhupada would say, no, GBC for life, you have to do it, no matter how poorly you're doing the service. I said GBC for life, so you have to remain a GBC. I couldn't really imagine that that was what Prabhupada intended by that. But for some reason, he did say those words, and therefore some GBCs kind of feel that, you know, they shouldn't step away and let someone new come into that service. So that's a little bit of a complication as well. But notwithstanding that, as I say, I mean, actually, you know, the GBC that I was closest to and have known best all my life really was Shiva Ram Swami, and he stepped away. He stepped away, you know, so he you know, wasn't overly burdened by that quote from Srila Prabhupada. And now the GBC that's taken over from him, a devotee called Krishna and Prabhupada, he's in his 40s, you know, so yeah. So what was the question, 10 years?
Well, it's just about succession generally. And it sounds like, as you're saying, there's a osmotic version of it going on.
Osmotic, yeah, but inevitable time we'll deal with it. But we are trying to deal with it as well. And between the two, we're going to fall somewhere in the middle, I guess, you know.
Well, look, a massive thank you, Praghosh Prabhu, for coming and answering our questions, for putting a human face to the GBC. I'm sure there'll be many more questions. There are plenty more here that I just haven't asked. And there may well be more. There may be people who'll tell me, oh, you should have asked him this and you should have asked him that. So maybe we can either have you or one of your peers on in the future as well. But look, do appreciate you speaking so forthrightly. And I think, you know, that was quite encouraging. And we pray that Prabhupada gives you all intelligence and strength to do a sterling job of leading his organization.
You're very kind, Damodar Prabhu. Nice talking and touching base with you again. Haven't seen you for some years. And I wish you all well in your service. And for all of those that are tuning in, I thank them for tuning in. And yeah, I just give a commitment that we will continue on with the good fight, basically.
So I'm just going to end the broadcast now, but stay on for a little bit, Praghosh ji. Hari Bolo. Thank you.
Hari Bolo.